2 years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, I moved into my first apartment. I'm a 22-year-old woman, and up until then, I had either lived in a dorm during my freshman year or with my mom. So, this was a big deal for me, finally having my own space. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and I shared it with my best friend, Josh. We had known each other since we were 13, and it was his first year at the university. I was excited to show him around and introduce him to my favorite places on campus and in the city. Fast forward to homecoming weekend. Our university is big on football, and homecoming is a huge event. Josh was pumped because it was his first homecoming game. He met this girl, Evelyn, and wanted me to come along, but for some reason, I didn't feel like going that night. Josh and I got into a bit of an argument, said some dumb things to each other, and he left with Evelyn. I was alone for the night. I had my little dog, Poppy, with me. She was about a year old at the time and usually pretty chill. That night, I just took it easy. I showered, put on a face mask, and Poppy and I hung out watching TV in bed. I had this one song stuck in my head, so I played it on repeat all day. Even now, when I hear that song, it takes me back to that night. We went to bed around 10 p.m., and I wasn't thinking much about Josh or the homecoming game. I know he would probably be out late with Evelyn anyway. At some point, I woke up to this loud noise, banging and the sound of cabinets slamming. It was so loud, it pulled me out of a deep sleep. Poppy was startled too, barking like crazy at the edge of the bed. The room was dark, except for the light coming from the kitchen, spilling in under my door. It sounded like someone was going through the kitchen cabinets one by one. I called out weakly, "Hello?" even though I knew it wasn't Josh and Evelyn. That's when my bedroom door slowly opened, and I jumped, my heart racing. I couldn't see much because the light from the kitchen was so bright, but I saw the figure of someone wearing a hoodie standing there, just staring. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. Poppy was losing it, barking and growling, ready to lunge at him. After what felt like forever, he closed the door. I was frozen. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't let me. Then, just as suddenly, the door flew open again. This time, we were face to face. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I was terrified he was going to hurt me. Poppy, even though she's small, was growling like a much bigger dog. The guy stood there for a moment longer, then slammed the door shut again with a loud bang. That was enough to snap me out of it. I jumped out of bed and locked the door as fast as I could. I could hear him moving around the apartment, and then I realized he had grabbed my car keys. I panicked, thinking he was going to steal my car since it was parked right outside. I called 911, sobbing, barely able to explain what was happening. It felt like it took forever for the police to arrive, though I lived just a few minutes away. By the time they got there, it had been at least 30 minutes. When I finally came out of my room, the apartment was a mess. The living room and Josh's bedroom were completely trashed. They had tried to take the TV but left it on the floor. They took my Xbox, all my games, and even my backpack with my textbooks and homework inside. When the police arrived, I told them everything that had happened. They asked if they could dust for fingerprints, so I let them try. But one of the officers dropped his flashlight on the TV screen and shattered it. I was so frustrated. When Josh and Evelyn finally got back, the police started acting weird. They pulled me aside and suggested that Josh might have hired someone to rob his own apartment while I was inside. I was shocked. I explained that Josh and I had been friends since we were kids, and we moved in together to make college life easier. But they didn't seem to believe me. After the police left, we changed the locks the next day. I had to take a day off school and drive 30 minutes to the nearest Nissan dealership to get a new key fob made for my car. The police never followed up with me about the case, and I never heard if they caught the person who broke in. It's been 2 years now, and nothing strange has happened since. No weird break-ins, no signs of the robber coming back. But I'll never forget that night. About 3 years ago, I moved into this apartment with my 2 young kids. I'm 25 now, and at the time my daughter was 2, so I added an extra lock to the front door to keep her from wandering out. But now, I think that same lock has been keeping someone else out, and it's making me feel paranoid and unsafe. The first time it happened, my daughter wasn't in school yet, and my son was just a few months old. My partner works irregular hours, but he usually tells me when he's coming home so I can unlock the top lock for him. That night, my daughter, who was 4 at the time, ran to the door like she usually does when her dad comes home. But instead of him, I heard someone try to open the door. They stopped because of the lock. My daughter unlocked the door by herself, which she never does. I was about to scold her when she came back and said, "Mommy, it wasn't Daddy, it was someone else." She said it so casually, like it was no big deal. I asked her if it was one of our neighbors. We know them pretty well. But she said, "No, it was a guy." That sent chills down my spine. I told my partner, and we explained to our daughter that she should never open the door by herself again. After that, I made sure to always keep the top lock on. I tried to shrug it off as a weird accident and forget about it. But then, one night around 12:30 a.m., the kids were in bed, and my partner and I were watching TV. Suddenly, we heard someone trying to open the door again. This time, they rang the doorbell and knocked lightly. My partner looked through the peephole and saw 3 men standing outside. I told him not to answer the door. I went to the window and carefully peeked outside, but I didn't see anyone leave. It was eerie. It made me think they might be hiding in the stairwell, waiting for us to open the door. I thought about calling the police, but hesitated. It seemed like such a small thing, people ringing the bell and trying the door handle, but it felt like more than that. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being targeted. It sounds paranoid, but we've lived here for 3 years, and nothing like this has happened until recently. The scariest part came about 2 or 3 weeks ago. My partner and I were asleep when around 3 a.m., we heard what we thought was our daughter waking up from a nightmare. She's 5 now and sometimes has bad dreams, so we didn't think much of it at first. My partner got up to check on her, but then there was a loud thud at the front door, followed by the sound of someone running. It wasn't our daughter after all. My partner looked through the peephole, but no one was there. I immediately took the kids into our room, locked the door, and pushed something heavy in front of it. I was terrified. The next morning we told our landlord and she promised to get someone to patrol the area. Things calmed down for a while after that. I've been extra cautious, only opening the door for people I know. But today, while my daughter was at school and my partner was at work, it happened again. I had just gotten out of the shower, and my son was playing in his pack and play. There was knocking at the door, but I wasn't expecting anyone, so I didn't answer. Then I heard someone trying to open the door again. I can't take it anymore. I feel so unsafe here, especially with my kids. I'm seriously thinking about moving because this place no longer feels like home. It feels like a threat. Back in 2012, a childhood friend asked if I wanted to be her roommate. I was ready to move out of my parents' house, and she needed help with rent. The place was a small but cozy cabin, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had wooden walls, a front porch, and tall trees all around. We figured the cabin was built in the 1700s, and the road nearby was named after the family that originally owned the land, which is now part of one of the biggest cities in the U.S. At first, we thought the cabin might have been used as slave quarters since the area was known for farming, but later, we found out it was likely used as a stable. That made sense because one time our dog dug up an old horseshoe, which I still have. The night we moved in, I could tell something was off. There were no doors upstairs where my room was, and none for the downstairs bedroom, which was an addition built in the 80s. The previous owners also added a kitchen and bathroom because the original cabin didn't have those. As soon as I moved in, I felt like I was being watched. The house always felt dark, cold, and damp, almost like a cellar. I expected that in such an old house, but it still didn't feel right. Every night I'd wake up to a scratching sound right under my bed, near my head. It was loud enough to wake me up, and I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. At first I thought it was mice, but the sound wasn't right. It was slow and long, like something was dragging along the wood, about a foot at a time. I was 23, and even though I felt like a kid hiding under the covers, I wasn't going to mess with whatever was making that noise. One night I heard it again, but this time I was still awake. It started on the ceiling, far from my bed, and slowly moved down the wall, eventually reaching right underneath me. After a while it traveled across the room, back to the wall, and then stopped. That's when I knew it wasn't mice. The walls were solid wood, with no gaps for anything to crawl through. The floor didn't have any space between the ceiling below and the floor above. It didn't make sense for an animal to make such loud, clear noises in solid wood. I got scared and started sleeping downstairs. My roommate, who's now my wife, asked what was going on, so I told her. She said the same things happened to her when she was home alone, and this was only in the first week of us living there. Here's the creepy part. When we moved in, I had to unscrew all the screws the last renter had put in the windows. There were hundreds of catalogs for the last renter, so we joked that he was a shut-in Satanist. Now, I think we weren't far off. Both of us started sleeping downstairs in the living room because we felt safer together. The weird feeling was easier to handle when someone was with me. But one night, I had a dream that a dark figure was coming toward me. It felt like I was watching myself sleep. The figure loomed over my head, and I felt pressure building in my head along with a high-pitched ringing in my ears. It got so intense that I woke up with a start. A second later, the TV turned off by itself. We'd been having issues with the TV randomly turning on and off, but this time felt different. I knew I had turned it off before going to bed. So why was it on in the first place? After that, we started sleeping in her room. She told me nothing strange happened in there, maybe because it was an addition to the original cabin. I don't know, but it felt safer. Funny enough, the ghosts seem to have played matchmaker because we've now been married for 5 years. One time, while upstairs reading, I started to fall asleep when the window began opening and closing by itself. I was fed up with the spirit by then, so the next day, I set up the same situation to see if it would happen again. It did. I yelled at it to leave us alone because I was tired of its nonsense, and it worked for a while. But when I was home alone, alarm clocks would go off right after my wife left. Drawers would open, and I'd hear banging on the front door. Eventually, though, the strange things slowed down and stopped completely. Now, the house feels normal. I spend time there alone and don't feel any bad vibes. Hopefully, it stays that way because I'd rather not deal with that creepy stuff again. When my sister started her first year at university, she moved into an apartment right across from the LA National Cemetery. On move-in day, my dad and I helped her carry boxes and set up her things. But after we left, my dad told me something in the apartment made him uneasy and he was worried about her staying there. Now, for a little background, my dad is a doctor, but he's also very religious and has experienced a lot of strange things over the years. He's had premonitions that came true exactly as he predicted, and sometimes this even scared the people around him. He also says he can see things most people would call paranormal, like spirits or demonic beings, and to him, these encounters feel very real. Thankfully, I didn't inherit this ability. Anyway, my dad explained that as soon as we walked into my sister's apartment, he saw a dark shadow quickly move through the living room and slip out through the back window. The blinds even spread apart like something had moved through them. At first, he thought it might have been an animal, but when he checked, the window was completely closed and locked, which made him feel uneasy. The window also happened to face the cemetery. Over the next 2 years, my sister and her roommates experienced several strange events. For instance, my sister would often hear her name being called from the living room, even when no one else was home. She would also feel a cold breeze pass by her when all the windows were closed. Her roommates reported hearing strange noises, like footsteps in the hallway, or finding items moved around for no reason. They would even wake up at night feeling someone tap or shake their legs or whisper their names. One night when I was visiting, my sister's roommate invited us up to her loft. She asked us to watch her arm as she stood in one spot in the room. We could see the hairs on her arm stand straight up as if something was there. It was creepy. Each time she stepped out of that spot, the hairs would fall back down, and when she returned, they would stand up again. She did this a few times, and it was the same every time, like something invisible was there. It wasn't just my sister's apartment, though. Her neighbor also had strange experiences. The girl next door claimed she could see a spirit. When she came over to my sister's apartment, she would sometimes step aside suddenly, as if letting someone pass by. It was like she could sense a presence we couldn't see. This really freaked out my sister, so she stopped inviting her over. The same neighbor shared a story about her boyfriend, who was a strong, athletic guy. One day, while he was at the apartment, he was suddenly shoved backward to the ground, like someone had tackled him. Once, when my sister was alone in the apartment, she kept hearing her name being called from the upstairs loft. It scared her so much that she called me and begged me to come over. I was in college in San Diego at the time, about 2 hours away, and it was already after midnight. I was at a party, but I knew her place was truly haunted, so I made the drive to stay with her. Luckily, nothing strange happened while I was there that weekend. Even so, my sister couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her whenever she was alone in that apartment. I'm a 25-year-old woman, and I moved to a new part of town by myself with my dog back in November. The area has a cool, artsy vibe, with lots of unique cafes, art galleries, and trendy shops. Even though there's a bit more crime here than in other neighborhoods, I still like it. There are nice bars and restaurants nearby, and the dog parks are great for my dog to run around and make friends. I live in a small 6-unit building on the ground floor. It's pretty quiet, and I'm the only single person living here. The front entrance is secure, but the back gate doesn't lock, so anyone can come in through the back door, which always made me a little uneasy. Not long after I moved in, my dog got really sick. She started having seizures every time she ate, and it terrified me. I took her to the vet, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong right away. She was throwing up every 2 hours, and I was barely sleeping, just constantly cleaning up after her. It was exhausting and stressful, and I felt so helpless watching her suffer. After 2 months of this, I finally took her to a better emergency vet clinic, where they kept her overnight. I remember rushing her there, carrying her in my arms, crying the whole time. I was so worried and completely drained. When I got home from the clinic that night, it was around 7 p.m. I was exhausted and anxious, waiting for updates from the vet, who called me every 30 minutes or so. Then, around 1:15 a.m., after another call from the vet, I heard something at my back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard someone trying to turn the door handle. They'd jiggle it, walk away, and then come back and try again. I didn't hesitate. I called 911 at 1:29 a.m. The police arrived quickly with about 10 officers, flashlights in hand, which made me feel a little safer. They checked every room and closet, but didn't find anything unusual. 2 days later, I installed a Ring doorbell to keep an eye on things. I was so scared after what happened that I stayed at a hotel for 2 nights because I hadn't slept in over 36 hours. Even now, I don't feel completely safe here. My landlord still hasn't fixed the lock on the back gate or added any extra security to the back door. I haven't paid my rent this month because of all this, but now I've gotten a notice saying I'll have to pay late fees if I don't pay soon. They've also mentioned that I could move to a different building and take over a new lease, which might be a good chance for me to find a safer place. I'm not sure what to do yet. There's a lot to think about with everything that's happened. Back in 1979, when my mom was in her mid-20s, she shared an apartment with a friend on a quiet, slightly run-down street in Jackson, Mississippi. This was a few years before she married my dad. Her roommate, who was a musician, was out of town for the weekend and wasn't expected back until Monday. So my mom knew she'd be alone for a few days. On Sunday night, my mom went to bed feeling a little uneasy, being by herself in the apartment. As she was starting to fall asleep, She suddenly heard a noise in the front room, like something rattling. Then, moments later, she heard the front door creak open. At first, she thought her roommate had come back early, but then she realized the light wasn't on, and her roommate wasn't saying anything. Instead, she heard quiet shuffling and things being moved around. That's when it hit her. Someone else was in the apartment. There was only one room between my mom and the intruder, and she knew he was getting closer. Behind her, near the kitchen, was a back door, but it was always locked, and she didn't have a key. She felt trapped with no way out. Being religious, she started to pray, asking for guidance. As she prayed, her mind cleared, and she felt a strange sense of calm. Instead of panicking, she decided the best thing to do was stay perfectly still and quiet, hoping the intruder wouldn't notice her. She hoped the man would just take whatever money was in her purse and leave. As she lay there, her face buried in the pillow, she was trembling with fear. Then, she opened her eyes just a little and saw a tall figure standing in the doorway. He was huge, taller than her fiancé, who was 6'4". The man's shadow stretched across the room as he stepped closer to her bed. My mom stayed frozen, thinking her only chance of staying safe was to pretend to be asleep. The man stopped at the foot of her bed and tilted his head from side to side, as if he was trying to get a better look at her. That's when her fear took over, and she let out the loudest scream she could, hoping someone would hear her. After she stopped screaming, she realized the man had turned and walked back out, leaving through the front door, which he quietly closed behind him. Shaking, my mom quickly locked the door and turned on all the lights, realizing this had been no dream. She called the police and reported what happened. The man had only taken a few dollars from her purse. The police asked her to look at small photos to see if she could identify him, but since she hadn't seen his face clearly, all the pictures looked the same to her. After a lot of thinking, she finally chose one. The detective, someone my mom recognized from the University of Southern Mississippi, where she had taken classes, seemed disappointed. He pointed to another photo and said, "I wish you had picked this guy instead. He's 6'6" and just got out of prison last week. He lives 2 streets away." Nothing more came of the police report. A week later, my mom read about a similar break-in that happened just a few blocks away. After that, she decided to stay with a friend for a few weeks to feel safer. Even though her roommate returned, my mom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. She packed up and left the apartment, and for a long time after, the memory of that night haunted her, making it hard for her to sleep or feel at peace.